This week, we are going to follow up on what you learned about last week when you did your Prezi on one of the topics from the 13 colonies and the 3 regions of the English colonies. So remember, as you see on the picture here, there were 3 specific sections of the 13 English colonies. You had the region of New England up here with Massachusetts, New Hampshire, um, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. You also had the middle colonies, which were New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and then the southern colonies, which included Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. On this particular map, you also see the Indian Territory and Spanish Territory. So all of the orange here was area that was occupied by Native Americans. The red to the bottom of the screen would have been Spanish Florida or Spanish territory at the time. So we want to look first today at what type of people came to the 13 English colonies. What type of specific person would decide to leave England or Spain or any other country, specifically though for England, and come to the Americas? Well, there were 5 specific type of people that we're going to talk about today. Number 1 were wealth seekers. These were people that were coming here for one reason and one reason only. That was because they wanted to get rich. Remember, the first thing that we should really talk about before we talk about all 5 of the types of people that came to the Americas or to the English colonies, you want to keep in mind that Great Britain was made up of 2 islands that were becoming very overpopulated. There was a lot of people being born, and obviously the land wasn't getting bigger, and so they began to run out of land for people to live, and there were less jobs. There weren't enough jobs for everyone, and so as a result of the overpopulation, this was a push factor that pushed people out of England and to the English colonies. The second type of person that came to the English colonies was a religious minority. This would have been something like the Quakers that we have talked about already, or the Pilgrims or the Puritans from the Plymouth colony. Religious minorities wanted to escape persecution, which is when you are treated very badly for your specific religious beliefs. The third type of person that we are looking at today that came to the 13 colonies were people that were poor. Poor people that wanted to escape poverty. As I mentioned a minute ago, in England and in Great Britain, when there wasn't enough jobs for the amount of people there were, that caused many people to become poor. And in order to escape poverty, some of those poor people decided to come to the 13 English colonies in the Americas as an escape out of their poverty. They saw it as an opportunity for a new start. The fourth group of people that came to the 13 English colonies were African slaves. And of course, these people were brought here against their own will, and they were brought here to serve as slaves. They did not have the opportunity to pursue their own ability to make money or to have a farm or raise a family. All of these things were taken away from them as they were brought here as slaves. The fifth and final type of person that we're talking about that came to the 13 English colonies were Native Americans. And technically they were already here in the colonies when the English arrived, and of course they were kind of run over by the other 4 groups. The first region that we'll talk about today is the New England colonies, and these 4 colonies included New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. You can see from the map here that New Hampshire is up here in the green, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and then Rhode Island. This area up here to the northeast of New Hampshire is what is today known as Maine. That was actually part of the colonies, but it was included in the Massachusetts colony at the time. The New England colonies had some interesting aspects about them. The first one was that they were founded on the idea of religious freedom. However, there were people like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams who kind of questioned the church, and they were actually kicked out of the colonies out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony specifically because of their different religious beliefs. Anne Hutchinson specifically was a woman who was doing preaching, and a lot of the men that were in charge of the church weren't really excited about this, and so they ended up accusing her of being a witch, and eventually she gets exiled from the colony. Roger Williams, much the same way, but not because he was a woman. Obviously, he was a man, but because he taught different things than the Puritan leaders in Massachusetts wanted to be taught. He was eventually kicked out or exiled from the colony. He ends up starting the colony of Rhode Island. The Pilgrims and later the Puritans ended up leaving England to come to the English colonies, again searching for that religious freedom. Um, and women did have a fair amount of rights in the New England colonies. They were able to do things like sign contracts. They were able to sue other people. And widows could even own property, the property of their husbands, when their husbands passed away. However, women were still expected to have the traditional role of staying at home and raising children and taking care of the home and things like that. The three keys to the New England colonies economy were as follows, and these are really important for you to remember. You're going to see them down the road on an exam. The three keys to the New England colonies economy were fishing. They were near lots of water, and so they had lots of opportunities to fish. Trapping and fur trading, because you had lots of forests, and so therefore you had wood. I mean, you had, you had lots of animals that you could trap and trade the furs. And then finally, shipbuilding. You need two things in order to be able to build ships. You need lumber, which there was lots of forests, and you need water. And both of these were in plenty in the New England colonies. The other thing to make note of here is that the reason why these colonies were relying on fishing, trapping, and shipbuilding is because farming wasn't really an option. Commercial farming in the New England colonies was not really available to them because of the fact that it was too cold for too long of a period of time in the year for them to really be serious about farming. Most people had small farms where they raised enough food to feed their families. However, they were not able to have big farms where they they grew lots of extra crops to be able to sell at the market. The New England colonies are also famous because of the Salem witch trials. A group of young girls a group of young girls accused some women, including a slave, of casting a spell on them. Historians think that possibly what happened was that the slave girl told these young girls some very scary stories, and they may have had nightmares, and they ended up accusing a few women of witchcraft or of casting spells on them. Over the course of a few months in 1692, literally hundreds of people were accused of being witches or taking part in witchcraft. Eventually, 18 women, one man, and even 2 dogs were killed after being accused of being witches. Usually, they were forced to confess, and then once they confessed, they were found guilty and they were killed. If they refused to confess, they were often killed anyway, and they were told that they were lying. The one man was even crushed to death with heavy stones for refusing to be put on trial for witchcraft. So he said, "You're not going to put me on trial?" They said, "Okay, fine. We won't put you on trial, but we're going to crush you to death with stones because we think you're guilty." Oftentimes, the way that someone was tested to see if they were a witch was they would tie a heavy millstone. This was a 50 to 100-pound stone. They would tie that to your chest and throw you into the river. And if you sank to the bottom and drowned, then they said you weren't a witch. But if you floated on the top of the water, then they said you were a witch, and they would hang you. Well, obviously this was a lose-lose situation, because if you sank to the bottom and drowned, you died. If you floated on the top of the river, you died anyway because they thought you were a witch. A lot of rumors have been circulated through movies and things like that witches were burned at the stake. That really is not how it went. The 18 women, one man, and 2 dogs that were accused of being witches were all hung. The dogs may have been shot, but definitely the 18 women and the one man were actually hung for supposedly being witches. Modern day historians think that possibly what happened in 1692 that caused all of this um, panic and paranoia over witches was that there may have been some sort of fungus or bacteria in that year's wheat crop that, as people ate it in bread and things like that, that it gave certain people, not everybody, but certain people hallucinations, and those hallucinations kind of led to this witch hunt, so to speak, in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. Next, we'll move to the Middle Colonies, and the Middle Colonies were consisted of Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and New Jersey. You're probably fairly familiar with these four, as these are the four modern states that are closest to us here in Pennsylvania. The Middle Colonies were really founded on the idea of religious freedom, but also they wanted to make money. The Middle Colonies were very diverse. Not only were there English colonists there, but there were also German, Welsh, Scotch-Irish, and even Dutch. Religious tolerance was a huge theme of the Middle Colonies. And on the picture on the right here, you can see what a Quaker would typically look like. And we'll talk about Quakers more in just a second. Well, we'll start with Pennsylvania. Of course, Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn. Hopefully you learned about that in elementary school. But William Penn, this is not William Penn. The picture that you see here is not William Penn. But this picture on the Quaker Oats box is showing you a good idea of what Quakers would have dressed like back then. But William Penn belonged to the Quakers, and Quakers were a religious sect that wanted to also come to the Americas to get away from the Church of England and have religious freedom. The Quakers believed that anyone should be able to speak during church, even women. So even if you are a woman, you should have the right and the ability to speak during church, which was revolutionary at the time. Quakers also were pacifists. And what pacifism means is that you oppose violence of any form. And violence of any form would include war. And so when we had the French and Indian War, and later on the Revolutionary War, Quakers were unwilling to fight. Most Quakers were unwilling to fight and be a part of those wars. Well, William Penn had some really good things about him, and two specific positives that we'll talk about today is William Penn actually paid Native Americans for their land. This was really kind of the first time in the English colonies where someone from Europe or from England was willing to try to pay a fair price to the Native Americans for their land. And William Penn did this. In fact, there are specific paintings and different historical documents that show proof that William Penn would often try to ask the Native Americans what they believed a fair value for their land was before he attempted to buy it from them. The second positive about William Penn is that he established religious freedom in Pennsylvania. Not only did William Penn want Quakers to be able to come to Pennsylvania, but he wanted Jews and Catholics and many other religious faiths to be able to come and live in Pennsylvania, and he really wanted to create a religiously free colony. In fact, William Penn's idea of a colony ends up being called a holy experiment because of all of the different religious faiths that came to Pennsylvania. Well, William Penn also did have a couple of negatives about him. He really was a very poor money manager. In fact, he ends up retiring, or as he dies, he ends up dying in England on the streets, poor and a beggar, despite the fact that he had all this money and was able to found this colony on religious freedom, and he had inherited lots of money. He ends up squandering his money away, and he kind of dies very poor in the streets of London. The second negative about William Penn is, despite the fact that he believed in all of this religious freedom, he was in fact a slave owner. So in a time where many people owned slaves, William Penn was unable to kind of make this connection of slavery, owning slaves, and saying that you believe in freedom were things that were working against each other. One more thing that we need to talk about when we're talking about Pennsylvania is the walking purchase. Well, William Penn had long since moved back to England in 1737, and his sons are kind of in charge of Pennsylvania. And his sons wanted to get more land for Pennsylvania from the Native Americans, and they wanted to do this in a way that would benefit them. They were not like their father in the sense of wanting to pay the Native Americans fairly for their land. They wanted to try to cheat or swindle the Native Americans out of their land. And so his sons end up cheating the Delaware Indians out of 1.2 million acres of land. And here's how they did it. They proposed to the Native Americans that they would be able to buy from the Native Americans however much land one man could walk in 1.5 days. Well, William Penn's sons went all about the colonies looking for the fastest runner in the colonies. Literally, they were looking for the Usain Bolt of the colonies. And when they found this fastest runner, they had this person run for a day and a half. Rather than just walking what a normal walk would be for a day and a half, they had this person run a day and a half. And they ended up cheating the Delaware Indians out of 1.2 acres of land. And on the map here, you can actually see here where I'm circling this huge chunk of land in what is today the Poconos region, North Philadelphia up to the Poconos region, that William Penn's sons cheated the Delaware Indians out of. The Delaware Indians end up moving west. The Delaware Indians ended up moving west all the way to what is today Western PA. The Middle Colonies economy. The Middle Colonies were so focused on wheat and barley and oats that they became known as the Breadbasket Colonies. There was lots and lots of wheat, barley, and oats. The things that are used to make bread were made in the Middle Colonies. It was a perfect climate for it, and the growing season was just right. Also, livestock was raised here, like cows and pigs and things like that. And the role of women was much more towards the traditional, where women mainly managed the home and raised children. Finally, today we're going to look at the Southern Colonies. The Southern Colonies consisted of Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And the Southern Colonies economy was heavily reliant on agriculture. The South was much warmer than the rest of the 13 colonies, and as a result, your growing season was even longer than any of the other two regions. So the Southern colonies were able to grow things like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Of course, you're familiar with tobacco and rice. If you don't know what indigo is, it's this plant right here that you see in the picture. It was a bluish purple colored plant that could be broken down and mixed with water to create a dye that was used for clothing and curtains and things like that. Also in the South, because you had these huge farms or plantations as they were called, you needed lots of people to work your tobacco fields and your indigo fields. And as a result, the South became very reliant on slavery. The first slaves arrive in the Americas in 1619 at Jamestown, as we learned a couple of weeks ago. Finally, today we're going to talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Partially we talk about Bacon's Rebellion because his last name was Bacon, and bacon is so good we need to talk about bacon whenever we can. But Nathaniel Bacon was a former indentured servant who protested the fact that the government of Virginia was raising and putting new taxes on indentured servants who had just gained their freedom. He also was protesting the fact that Native Americans had been attacking farmers that were on the frontier, all the way on the western side of the English colonies, and Native Americans had been attacking them. And Bacon and other former indentured servants requested help from the Virginia government, and the governor said no. And what happened was Bacon and his men end up kind of having this mini rebellion where they literally march on Jamestown, the capital of Virginia at the time, and they demand changes be done. And as they demanded changes be done, the rebellion is kind of squashed. and Bacon ends up being killed. But the moral of the Bacon's Rebellion is that we remember that the people in the colonies, specifically these indentured servants that had just been freed, they refused to pay newer, higher taxes unless they had more of the say in government. And stay tuned, because we're going to talk much more about this as we get to the causes of the American Revolution in a few weeks. So that's it for the three regions. At this point, what you want to do is stop the YouTube video and go ahead and take your quiz. Remember, if you feel like you need to go back while you're taking your quiz and check any parts of the YouTube video, you can certainly do that. So feel free to watch this again or to go back and check out certain parts while you're taking the quiz.